My name is Sophie Lang. I am 34 years old. On a Thursday afternoon in November, a man I had not seen in 2 years walked through my mother's front door, placed a gold wedding ring on the kitchen table in front of my entire family, and said, without any preparation at all, that I was the reason he was alive to wear it. My mother looked at the ring. Then she looked at me, and in the 15 seconds that followed, I watched her understand something she had never understood in the 7 years I had been doing the job she could never explain to anyone. That afternoon undid something in me and remade it at the same time. I have been trying to find the right words for what it did since then, and I am still not entirely sure I have them, but I am going to try. Because some things need to be said out loud even when the saying takes a long time. This is what happened, this is what it cost. And this is what I finally got to watch my mother learn. I should begin where beginnings actually begin, which is not at some dramatic crossroads, but in an ordinary room with an ordinary choice that felt, at the time, like it was probably the wrong one. I was 26 years old when I decided not to take the hospital administration placement. I had spent 3 years in a graduate program telling myself I was the kind of person who was good at systems, at structures, at the organized management of large institutions. I was reasonably good at those things. I had the grades to prove it and the internship evaluations to back them up and a letter of acceptance to a fellowship in healthcare operations that my advisor described as competitive. My mother had read that letter 3 times at the kitchen table in her house in Brentwood, Tennessee. And each time she read it, her face had the specific quality of relief that comes from watching something fall into the right category. She understood hospital administration. It had a title, it had a salary structure, it had a trajectory you could describe to someone at church without watching their eyes go slightly distant. What I did instead, I cannot fully explain even now. There had been an internship placement in my second year at a veteran service center 40 minutes from campus, 2 afternoons a week. I had been assigned there to fulfill a community health component of the program, and I had expected to learn about resource coordination and referral networks, and the kind of administrative support that exists around counseling services, without actually being counseling itself. What happened instead was Gerald Owens. Gerald Owens was 53 years old and had been doing veterans crisis counseling for 22 years. He was a compact man with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of stillness in his face that you only develop after a very long time in the presence of great pain. He did not explain the work to me. He handed me a chair and a phone, and he said, "Sit beside me," and I sat beside him. And on that first Tuesday afternoon in February, he took a call that lasted 47 minutes, and I sat beside him and listened to his half of it, which was mostly silence and occasional short words, and at the end he hung up and sat for a moment, and then he looked at me and said, "Well, what did you hear?" I said, "I heard a man who was very tired." He said, "What else?" I said, "I heard him get a little less tired about halfway through." Gerald looked at me for a moment. He said, "That's the job. You hear them. You stay with them until the tire changes. That is the whole job." I said it seemed like not enough. He said, "Most people think that until they've done it for a year and they realize that being heard is the thing people have been most hungry for their entire lives and almost never get, then it seems like everything." I went home that night and sat in my apartment and looked at the hospital administration letter on the counter, and I thought about Gerald's voice in that call. The way it created a kind of stillness on the other end that you could feel even from the outside. I thought about the man on the other end of that phone, whoever he was, and what it had cost him to call, and what those 47 minutes had given him that nothing else in his life that day had been able to. I thought about that for a long time. In the morning, I made a decision. I called the fellowship program and withdrew my application. I called the Veteran Service Center and asked about the counselor certification pathway. I did not call my mother until the following Sunday over dinner, which I had planned specifically because I had learned early in life that important conversations with my mother were easier to have when her hands were occupied. She was making pasta. I told her. She said, "I'm sorry, what do you mean you withdrew?" I said, "I withdrew the application." She said, "Sophie." I said, "I know." She said, "That was a competitive placement." I said, "I know that." She said, "And you're going to do telephone counseling?" I said, "Crisis counseling for veterans, yes." She said, "At that center?" I said, "I'm going to get certified, and then yes, at the center or somewhere similar." She stirred the pasta for a while. She said, "And what does that look like, career-wise?" I said I wasn't sure yet. She said, "Does it have a salary structure?" I said, "Yes." It had a modest one. She said, "And benefits?" I said, "Yes, it had benefits." She said, "Okay." She did not say anything else about it that night. I ate the pasta and I went home and I sat with the decision, and it felt underneath everything, like the most solid thing I had ever done. It was the kind of solid that you can only feel from the inside. That was the problem from the very beginning. It was invisible solid, the kind that doesn't show up when people ask you how things are going, the kind that has no trophies and no headlines and no column in a spreadsheet that says outcomes and shows a number that goes up. That invisibility became the fault line in my relationship with my mother for the next 6 years. And I am only telling you this because the fault line is what makes the ring on the kitchen table mean what it means. I got my crisis counseling certification at 27. I started at the Veterans and Military Families Counseling Center in February of the year I turned 28. My supervisor in the first months was a woman named Deb Hartwell, who had been doing this work for 16 years and who had the kind of patience that reads as stillness until you realize it's actually iron, and then you understand why she never raises her voice and never needs to. Deb trained me on the specifics of the crisis call protocol and on the referral systems and on the documentation requirements, but the most important thing she trained me on, she never said directly. She modeled it. She took calls beside me the way Gerald had, and I listened. And what I learned was that the pauses are not empty. The pauses are where the most important information lives. The caller fills the pause with whatever they've been holding too tightly to say in words. You learn to wait for what lives in the pauses. I took my first solo call on a Wednesday in April. I do not remember the content clearly, which is how it should be. Confidentiality requires a specific quality of forgetting in the details while you hold the weight of the thing. What I remember is that the call lasted 31 minutes, and when I hung up, my hands were shaking slightly, and I sat at my desk and breathed for a while, and then I wrote in the case log, and then I looked at the next name on the sheet, and I answered the next call. This is the work. There is not a more complicated description of it than that. The first time my mother asked me about my success rate, I was 28 years old, and we were in her kitchen after Sunday dinner, and she was washing the baking dish she always used for the roast, and she said it the way she said. Things she was genuinely concerned about, which was sideways with her eyes on the task in front of her. She said, "Can you tell me how it's going? Like, is there a way to measure it?" I said I wasn't sure what measurement she was looking for. She said, "Well, in a law firm, you can see the case outcomes, wins and losses. Is there something like that?" I said, "Some days it looks like someone picks up the phone and is still on the phone an hour later." She made a sound that lived exactly in the middle of concern and dismissal, a sound I came to recognize as her own version of the pause, the place where what she actually meant was too complicated to say in words. She handed me a dish towel and said, "That seems hard to build a life on." I said I was building fine. She didn't say anything else. That pattern became the architecture of the next 6 years. She would ask something sideways. I would answer as fully as I could without saying the things I could not say. She would make the sound. We would move on. Neither of us was wrong. Exactly. She was afraid for me in the specific way that mothers afraid for their children often are, which is that the fear looks identical to criticism from certain angles. I had too much of her in me to name the angle directly. We were well matched in our capacity for the indirect approach, which meant we could go years having the same conversation slightly differently, and each time believing we were saying something new. What I could not tell her, what I can never tell anyone outside the professional world of this work, is what the calls actually are. The calls are not a telephone service. They are a specific and fragile kind of sanctuary. A man calls at 2 a.m. from a parking structure because he trusts the line, and the line is trustworthy because it is sealed, and the seal is the only reason he calls at all. The moment the seal means anything less than everything, the calls stop. And if the calls stop, the men and women sitting in parking structures at 2 a.m. are sitting there alone, with no voice on the other end, with nothing to hold. The confidentiality is not a technicality. It is the foundation. Without it, there is no building. So my mother knew my job the way you know something from a pamphlet. Veterans crisis counselor provides telephone support, makes referrals, follows up. She could describe the outline. She had no access to the substance, and I could not give it to her. And this gap between the outline and the substance became a kind of grief for both of us that neither of us had a name for. There was also, in those first years, the matter of the questions. The questions came at family gatherings, at holiday dinners, at the occasional weeknight dinner my mother organized with neighbors or relatives or old friends from the law firm where she had spent 30 years as an office manager. People asked the questions with varying degrees of care, and I answered them with varying degrees of frustration at my own inability to give a satisfying answer. What's your success rate? How do you know if it's working? Can you tell when someone really needs help versus when they're just calling? These are not bad questions. They are the questions of people who understand worth in terms they can count. And I grew up in a world that understood worth in those terms too, which meant the questions landed somewhere inside me that felt like doubt, even when it wasn't. My colleague and closest friend at the center was a woman named Priya Nair, who had taken the cubicle next to mine 6 months after I started, and who had been doing crisis counseling for 4 years before that. Priya was 31 when I met her, and she had the specific quality of warmth that some people are born with and the rest of us spend our lives approximating. She remembered every birthday in the office. She brought food from her mother's kitchen on the hard weeks. Without making an announcement about it, things just appeared. A container of dal on your desk, a box of sweets near the coffee machine. She knew when to talk and when to sit, and when the right thing to do was put a cup of coffee on the corner of your desk and walk away without comment. In crisis counseling, those are the most important capacities a person can have, and the fact that she had all three was why I trusted her completely from approximately the third week of our working together. She was also the person who found out about the budget review before the rest of us did, which was not because she went looking for information, but because she was the kind of person people told things to without quite knowing why. She came to my cubicle on a Tuesday morning in early spring and said, "I heard something and I want to tell you before Robert does." She told me, "The County Health Authority was reviewing our program's expenditures. They had flagged us for evaluation." The word evaluation was being used in the specific way that word gets used when it means something people are not yet willing to say directly. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "What do you want to do?" She said, "Fight for it." I said that was going to be my answer too. She said, "Good." She said, "How do we fight for something that's sealed?" I said, "We use what we have that doesn't break the seal." She said, "Numbers." I said, "Numbers." She said, "I hate numbers." I said, "I know." She said, "Will numbers be enough?" I said I did not know. We put together a case file over 2 weekends. Aggregate data, calls received by month, call duration averages, referral rates, follow-up contacts made, crisis intervention logs totaled by category. We made charts. We made a document that showed the program's performance over 4 years against national benchmarks. It was thorough and professional and entirely hollow in the way that the most important things always look when you strip them of the people inside them. You look at our case file and you see efficient telephone service. You don't see the Tuesday Potter. You don't see the combat medic. You don't see any of the hundreds of people whose specific weight and fear and particular darkness we carried on that line for whatever duration it took to find the way through. The numbers show you the shell. The people are inside the shell. The people are the whole point. The numbers cannot say that. I went to the budget meeting in March and sat across from 3 members of the County Health Authority in a conference room with fluorescent lighting and a water pitcher that nobody touched, and I presented the case file and said everything. I could say without saying what I could not say. One of the board members, a woman with reading glasses on a chain who seemed genuinely to be paying attention, asked me what the return on investment looked like for crisis telephone intervention services. I told her I was not sure how to express that in a form she would recognize. She said, "Try." I said, "The return on investment is that people who would not otherwise be alive are alive." She wrote something down. I have never known what she wrote. 3 weeks later, we received a letter informing us the program had been retained, with a note that performance metrics would be reviewed again in 12 months. Priya brought kolaches to the office the next morning, from the Good Place in East Nashville, a full box, and I ate 4 of them standing at the counter and did not feel the slightest bit embarrassed about it. Robert Calloway, our program director, a tired and honest man who had spent more years fighting for this program than I had been in it, bought a sheet cake from the grocery store and left it in the break room with a note that said, "Still here," which was the most accurate description of what we were celebrating that I could imagine. I told my mother about the budget review. I told her we won the retention argument. She said, "Good, honey," in the way she said things when she heard them but didn't know what to do with them. Then she asked about my sister Elena's new account in Atlanta, and I said I was glad for Elena, and I meant it, and we talked about that for a while. Elena is 2 years younger than me and has always known exactly what she wanted, which is something I find both clarifying and slightly exhausting to be around. She went into accounting with the same decisive energy she applies to everything in her life, and she was made a senior associate at her firm at 31, and she is genuinely excellent at her work, and I genuinely love her. The difficulty is not Elena. The difficulty is that Elena's version of excellent is visible in the specific way that my mother understands, visibility, which meant that every conversation about Elena's career was a conversation I could fully participate in, and every conversation about my own was one where I had to stop, just before the part that mattered. The engagement dinner was in early summer. Elena's firm had just promoted her and her fiancé, a tall, quiet structural engineer named Anand who had a very careful way of laughing, had proposed 3 weeks before, and my mother organized a dinner at her house with the kind of enthusiasm she reserved for events she could fully explain to the neighbors. Priya was dating Anand's college roommate at this point, in a coincidence that felt too improbable to be real, but was real, and she sent me a text the morning of the dinner that said, "Give Elena my love and try not to eat your feelings in the breadbasket." I sent back a response that was mostly laughing faces. I ate exactly the right amount of bread. At the dinner, my Aunt Carol, who had driven up from Chattanooga with the precision she applies to all family occasions, sat across from me and asked, "And Sophie, tell me what you're working on." I said, "Still crisis counseling at the center." She said, "That's the telephone thing." I said, "Yes." She said, "Good for you," and then asked Elena about the firm's equity structure, and I spent the next 20 minutes listening to a conversation about professional trajectories while I finished my salmon and reminded myself that I was happy for Elena, which I was, and that my Aunt Carol's inability to ask a second question about my work was not a comment on its value, which I was less certain about. The drive home from that dinner was 47 minutes in light traffic, and I spent most of it in the specific internal argument I had with myself after family events, which went roughly as follows. The first voice said, "They don't understand because you can't explain." The second voice said, "That is a very convenient way to feel superior about being misunderstood." The first voice said, "That is not what I am doing." The second voice said, "You are a little bit what I am doing." I drove. The argument did not resolve. It almost never did. I got home and I made tea and I sat with the television on without watching it and I let the day settle. The call from Marcus Webb came in on a Thursday evening in October. He was the 217th call I had received that year, although I did not know that at the time. I know it now because I went back to the logs much later, after Thanksgiving, after everything changed, and I counted because I needed to see where he was in the year's sequence and what that meant about timing. The call came in at 7:14 in the evening. I can tell you that it lasted 1 hour and 23 minutes. I can tell you that his voice was even and controlled in the way that still voices sometimes are, when the decision has already been made in one part of a person and the other part is still deciding whether to agree with it. I can tell you that at the end of the call, he was still on the line. I can tell you that I gave him a referral number and he said he would call them. I can tell you that he said, before he hung up, that he had not thought there would be anyone who would just sit with it. I said, "I'm not going anywhere." He said, "Yeah, I know that now." Beyond those facts, I will not say anything else. And not because the rest of it was not important, but because the rest of it was private. And private things stay private. And that is the whole reason the line exists. He called back twice in November. He called once in December. In January, the calls stopped. I am going to describe what the silence of a stopped call feels like for someone in this work, because I think it is important and I think most people don't know it, and I think the not knowing is part of why people look at our aggregate numbers and see efficient telephone service instead of what is actually happening. When a regular caller stops calling, there is a period where you do not yet know what the silence means. The silence could mean they are better. The silence could mean they found another resource. It could mean their circumstances changed in the way circumstances sometimes change, which is not always in the direction of better. You cannot know. You are not supposed to chase the silence. You document the last contact and you note the case status and you move on to the next call, because the next call is also someone who needs to be heard. And you cannot sit inside the silence of one call while the next one is ringing. But the silence stays. It doesn't go away. It accumulates over years in the specific way that unanswered questions accumulate in a person who has trained themselves not to finish asking them. When Marcus stopped calling, I filed the log, I noted the last contact, I updated the case status the way I was trained to update it, and then I moved on in the sense that I continued taking calls and doing the work and going home and coming back. But some part of me did not move on in the way that some parts of you never move on. And I carried the silence of Marcus Webb stopped calling, the way I carried most things in that particular register, which was quietly and without ever setting it fully down. I did not tell anyone. There is no protocol for telling someone. You do your own processing in your own time and you come back to the desk and you take the next call and you stay on the line. The spring and summer after Marcus stopped calling were ordinary in the way that years in crisis counseling are ordinary, which means they were not ordinary at all but had a rhythm I knew how to move inside of. I took hundreds of calls. I supervised David, the new counselor who came in March at 24 with an earnest quality and a tendency to over-explain during calls, that I spent 2 months slowly and carefully correcting, and by July he was good at the job, genuinely good, And I felt something about that I did not immediately have a word for. Later I understood it was pride. My migraines came on schedule 3 or 4 times a month. Manageable with the ibuprofen I kept in the third drawer of my desk. The budget review came in June and we passed again. Robert bought another sheet cake. Priya's engagement to Anand was announced formally and I was asked to be a bridesmaid, which meant approximately 8 months of conversations about flowers that I engaged in with complete goodwill. My cousin Brianna got married in August at a barn venue in Franklin with string lights and a DJ who played exclusively 90s country. I drove down in my 2009 Subaru Outback, which had a crack in the front bumper and a passenger seat permanently reclined at 20 degrees because the adjustment lever had broken. Priya had found me a mechanic 3 separate times in the previous year, and I had declined all 3 times because the seat was not the problem that needed solving. I arrived at the venue 20 minutes early, which is a habit I have had since college and which I have stopped apologizing for. And I sat in the parking lot and ate a granola bar and listened to a news segment on the radio about veterans' mental health funding that I turned off after 90 seconds because there are limits to what you can carry on a Saturday. The ceremony was everything a ceremony should be. Brianna was radiant in the way people are radiant when they are doing exactly what they wanted to do. Her husband Paul, a large-shouldered man who fixed industrial equipment and who looked at Brianna with the uncomplicated devotion of a man who had figured out the most important thing, gave a speech at the reception that was 4 minutes long and made 11 people cry, including my mother, who does not usually cry at speeches. I drank 1 glass of champagne, I ate the chicken and the asparagus and a very good dinner roll. I danced once with my Uncle Dennis, who is 70 and still very good at dancing, and who told me I had my grandmother's posture, which was the nicest thing anyone had said to me in a while. I was getting a glass of water from the bar when I heard my mother's voice around a decorative pillar. She was talking to Brianna's mother, my Aunt Sherry, who had driven up from Georgia and who I genuinely like, and who was asking about me with the specific intention of being kind. I heard my mother say, "Sophie listens to troubled people on the phone. That's the job, essentially. She's wonderful at it, I'm sure, but it's not a career with a trajectory, really. You can't see the progress." I stood on the other side of that pillar for approximately 4 seconds. Then I took my water glass and I walked through the barn doors and across the grass lawn, and I sat on the hood of my Subaru in the parking lot and I looked at the string lights through the barn windows and I did not cry. I was very deliberate about not crying. I was 33 years old and I had been doing this work for 6 years, and I was not going to cry in a parking lot in Franklin, Tennessee over something I had known for 6 years. I sat there for 22 minutes. I know it was 22 minutes because I watched the clock on my phone. I sat there and I let myself think clearly about what I had just heard. Not the version I would tell Priya on Monday, which would be wry and contained and would make her laugh because that is how I process things when I have time to arrange them. The actual version, the version where I admit that the words can't see the progress, hit me somewhere that I had been carefully protecting since the very beginning. Because the progress lives inside the seal. And the seal is the whole thing. And as long as the seal holds, nobody on the outside can see what is actually happening. And the people on the outside of the seal include everyone I love. That is the job's specific grief, and I had never found a word for it that fit. I sat on the hood of the Subaru for 22 minutes, and then I decided 3 things. The first thing was that I was not going to say anything to my mother that night. The second thing was that I was not going to stop doing the work. The third thing was that the wedding cake was lemon with raspberry filling, and I had not yet had a piece, and that needed to be corrected immediately. I went back inside. The cake was excellent. I had 2 pieces. The DJ played something from 1994, and I danced again, this time without being asked, which is unusual for me and which I think surprised my mother because she looked at me from across the room with something complicated on her face, and I smiled at her and meant it because I had made my decisions and the decisions felt solid, and solid things can carry you even in the parking lots. October came around again. The anniversary of Marcus's call was on a Thursday, and I knew it was Thursday because I had looked at the log on the Tuesday before without quite meaning to, and then had spent a while sitting with the knowledge of the date and what I did not know about what had happened on the other side of it. I took 8 calls that Thursday. 3 of them were long. I had a migraine by 3 o'clock and took the ibuprofen and put the shade down and kept the calls going because the calls don't know about migraines. Priya brought me soup from the place on 2nd Avenue at 5 o'clock and put it on the corner of my desk without comment, which was perfect. When I reached the end of the call sheet, I turned to her cubicle and said, "Thank you for the soup." She said, "I've got you." I said, "I know." She said, "You want to talk?" I said, "Not right now." She said, "Okay." She packed up her things and went home, and I stayed for another 30 minutes writing up the day's documentation. And then I drove home in the Subaru with the reclined seat, and I made tea, and I did not write in the private journal. because I had not written in the private journal since Marcus stopped calling, and I was not ready to start again. Thanksgiving that year came on the 28th of November, which landed on a Thursday, the same day as Marcus's original call 2 years before, though I did not think about this until much later, and I am not sure it means anything except that sometimes timing has its own weight. I drove to my mother's house on Wednesday evening, as I had done every year since finishing my graduate program, because my mother makes pies on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving and the house smells like something I do not have a word for, but which means everything is fine, and I like being in the house when it smells like that. Elena drove up from downtown Nashville 45 minutes after me with a bottle of wine and pastries from a bakery she liked, which was normal. My Aunt Carol was arriving Thursday morning from Chattanooga, which was also normal. The Kennedys from down the street were coming for dinner, which was new but not surprising, because my mother treated hospitality as a practice to be continuously expanded. We ate a quiet dinner on Wednesday evening, the three of us at the kitchen table with the overhead light and the remains of a roasted chicken my mother had made earlier. Elena talked about the Atlanta client. My mother asked me how the center was doing, and I said it was doing well, and she said, good, and asked Elena something about benefit packages. And I ate my bread and told myself I was fine, which I mostly was. I slept in my old room, in the bed that has been slightly too small for me for about 8 years now, and lay there in the dark, running through the week's calls, the way I always did when I was trying to fall asleep in a place that wasn't my apartment. I went through them in order, not reviewing the content, just touching each one like items in a bag, making sure everything was accounted for. I had a light migraine starting behind my left eye, and I had taken ibuprofen before bed, and it was doing approximately half of what it needed to do. I fell asleep sometime after midnight. Thanksgiving morning came with the smell of something in the oven and the sound of my mother already in the kitchen at 7, which has been true every Thanksgiving of my life. I came downstairs at 8. She handed me coffee without being asked and told me to sit because she needed the counter space, and I sat at the kitchen table and drank my coffee and watched her cook. And this is, honestly and without qualification, one of my favorite things in the world. Not because it is picturesque, although it is, but because my mother in a kitchen is the most herself she ever is. And the self she is in the kitchen is someone I have loved completely since I was small enough to sit on the counter. Elena came down at 9. We set the table together. I peeled potatoes while my mother made the gravy base, and Elena arranged the centerpiece she had brought from the florist, a thing with winter berries and small pine branches that was more elegant than anything we had ever had on that table before, and which my mother studied with an expression of sincere appreciation. Priya texted me at 10 to say Happy Thanksgiving, don't overthink anything. The kolaches are still in the freezer at the office if you need them Monday. I sent back an excessive number of cranberry emojis. The neighbors arrived at 12:30. My Aunt Carol had come at 10 and was already deep in a conversation with my mother about something at their church. The house had the warm, accumulated sound of a family holiday in full swing, voices overlapping, something in the oven ticking down, the basset hounds underfoot. I was carrying the bread basket to the dining room table and calculating whether the turkey had another 20 minutes or 30, and thinking about whether I had signed the budget addendum Robert had sent on Tuesday when the doorbell rang. At 1:17. I know it was 1:17 because I had just looked at the stove clock while doing the turkey calculation. The doorbell rang, and there was a beat where nobody moved because we were not expecting anyone, and then my mother said, Carol, would you get that? And Aunt Carol went to the front hallway. I heard her open the door. I heard her say, oh, hello. I heard a voice say, I'm sorry to arrive without calling ahead. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm trying to find Sophie Lang. Is she here? I put down the bread basket. The dining room was 6 steps from the hallway. I took those steps slowly. I came around the corner and I stood in the hallway entrance, and I looked at the door and I looked at the man standing in it, and I stood very still for a long moment. The way you stand when your body catches up to something before your mind has finished forming the sentence. He was tall, taller than the voice had made me picture, which is a strange thing to say because you are not supposed to picture the voices on the other end of the line. But in the way that all things unseen become pictures in the mind, whether you invite the picture or not, I had pictured something smaller. He had a short beard with gray coming in at the jaw. He was wearing a dark jacket and he was holding a set of keys, and he looked, from the outside, like a man who had thought carefully about what he was going to say and was now standing in a doorway waiting to find out if he was in the right place. Standing slightly behind and beside him were 2 people. A woman with dark hair pulled back, maybe 34 or 35, with an attentive stillness about her face that I recognized immediately as the stillness of someone who has sat with hard things and come through to the other side. And holding her hand, a small girl in a coat with small bears on the buttons, approximately 4 years old, who was looking at the interior of the house with the complete unguarded curiosity of someone who has not yet learned to pretend otherwise. He looked at me. He said, "Are you Sophie Lang?" I said, "Yes." He said, "I found you through your colleague, a woman named Priya. She helped me find where you'd be. I hope that's all right." He said, "I have been trying to figure out the right way to do this for 2 years." I said, "Please come in." My mother appeared at my shoulder the way she always appears when someone is at her door, with the automatic warmth and the precisely welcoming face she has worn for 62 years of being the person who opens the door. She said, "Hello, please come in," and ushered them inside. And they came in, and I stood in my mother's front hallway looking at Marcus Webb standing on the welcome mat. And I understood, without having been told yet, that the silence had not meant what I had been carrying it as. The silence had meant something else. He had been trying to find the right way. 2 years of trying to find the right way. I held that fact carefully while everything else moved around me. We went to the kitchen because in my mother's house, every important conversation has ever happened in the kitchen and there was nowhere else to go. His wife's name was Dana. The little girl was Lily. Lily went directly to the corner where the 2 basset hounds, retired and enormous and entirely good-natured, had their beds, and she sat down on one of the beds without any hesitation at all and began to examine the nearer dog's ears with great seriousness. My mother was already saying something to Dana about the drive and whether they had eaten, and this was her house and there was plenty of food, because this is also who my mother is. And I stood by the kitchen counter and watched Marcus stand at the kitchen table, and I waited. He put his hand in the pocket of his jacket. He was quiet for a moment. Then he took out a gold ring, a simple band, no different from 1,000 others, and he set it down on the kitchen table. The sound it made was very small, a thin click of metal on wood, in a warm kitchen on a Thursday in November. My mother looked at the ring. Elena looked at the ring. Aunt Carol, who had come in from the dining room to see who had arrived, looked at the ring. Dana looked at her husband. Lily was still examining the dog's ears. The dog appeared to be accepting this without objection. Marcus looked at me. He said, "I'm going to be careful about what I say because I understand what you can and can't talk about." He paused. He said, 2 years ago, I was sitting in a parking lot on a Thursday night and I called a number and I got a voice. He said, I talked to that voice for a long time, and when the call was done, I was still on the phone. And I'm going to leave it there because the rest of it belongs to the call. But I want to say this in front of your family because I think it needs to be said where they can hear it. He touched the ring on the table with one finger. He said, "I married Dana 7 months after that night. Lily is ours. She just turned 4 in September." He said, "I am wearing this ring because you answered the phone. That is the entire reason I am standing here. You are the reason I was there to put this on." The kitchen was very quiet. I have tried since that afternoon to find the right word for what that quiet was. I have not found it. It was not the silence before something terrible, and it was not the silence after something terrible. It was the silence of something that had been wrong for a long time suddenly being right. The sound of a fault line closing. If a fault line closing makes a sound, which it may not, but it feels like it should, it felt like that. I said, "Marcus." He said, "I know I went quiet after December." He said, "I was in a hard stretch for several months after that, and then things started to move, and I kept meaning to find a way to reach out, but I didn't know if there were protocols. If I was allowed." I said, "There are no protocols for this." He said, "I thought maybe, but I needed you to know that it worked." He said, "Whatever happened on that call, it worked." I said, "You did that." I said, "I only stayed on the line." He said, "That was everything." Dana reached across and put her hand on his arm, the small, quiet gesture of someone who knows when words have done what they need to do. Lily had graduated from the dog's ears to sitting fully on the dog bed with her legs crossed, the dog's large head resting in her lap, her coat still buttoned, her face the absolute picture of a child who has found the correct place to be and intends to stay there indefinitely. I looked at my mother. She was still looking at the ring on the table. She had not said anything since Marcus began speaking. I watched her look at that small gold band on the kitchen table, and I watched something move through her face the way a change in weather moves through the sky. Not sudden, but not slow either. Something substantial shifting. She looked up at me. She said, "Is this—" She stopped. She said, "Does this happen?" Her voice was different from its usual register, quieter and more careful. I said, "Sometimes." She said, "And you can't tell us when it does." I said, "No." She said, "Since the beginning." I said, "Since the beginning. 7 years." She said the number back to me very quietly, not as a question, just repeating it, as though she was putting it down somewhere in herself to look at later. My mother turned to Marcus. She said, Thank you for coming here. She said it directly, with her eyes steady and no sideways in it at all. Just the plain thing. He said, I had to. I want her to know what she did. She nodded slowly and said, I'm glad you did. And she meant both things, which I could hear in the way she said them. She was glad he had come, and she was glad to know, and both of those were true at the same time. We ate Thanksgiving dinner with Marcus and Dana and Lily. Lily sat at the table with the focused seriousness of a 4-year-old who has decided that dinner is a task to be completed properly. She ate her mashed potatoes with methodical attention and at a certain point announced that the gravy was better without lumps, which everyone agreed was a reasonable position. My Aunt Carol asked Dana about school counseling, which was Dana's field, and they talked about that with the ease of two people in adjacent helping professions who have lots of practical things in common. Elena asked Marcus about his work, which was in facilities management, and he talked about it with the low-key ease of someone who has found a way to be useful that suits him. My mother served the turkey and the cranberry sauce and the potatoes and the rolls she had been making since Wednesday, and she served Dana's plate before her own the way she always serves guests, with the unconscious priority that is one of the truest things about her. After dinner, Lily fell asleep on the living room couch under a blanket my mother brought without being asked, and the basset hounds arranged themselves nearby with the deep satisfaction of dogs in the presence of sleeping children. The adults sat around the cleared dining room table with coffee and the remainder of the pie and talked at the volume and ease of people who have somehow known each other for longer than the evidence supports. Marcus and I stood on the back porch later. It was cold in the specific way that Tennessee November is cold, which is sharp and clear and not quite winter yet. He said, I know this was a lot to drop on you. I said it was all right. He said, I mean for you specifically. The surprise of it. I said I was okay with the surprise. He said, I figured you might be, eventually. But I wanted to make sure. I said, Marcus. He said, I know. I said, how long have you been planning this? He said, about a year, since I figured out your colleague's name. He said, Priya was very careful. She made sure she trusted me before she helped me. I said, that sounds exactly right. He said, she's protective of you. I said, I know that. He said, it's good to have people like that. We stood in the cold for a minute. He said, I started therapy about 18 months ago. Not just the crisis line. Actual ongoing therapy. He said, I want you to know that. I said, I'm glad. He said, it's different. It's its own thing. He said, but you were the first one. You were the night it turned. I said, the turning is yours. He said, maybe. He said, but the line was yours. And the line was what was there. And what was there mattered. I said, okay. He said, I'm going to say it counts. I said, okay. I wasn't going to argue with him. I didn't want to. The cold was very clear and the November sky was very dark and I didn't want to argue with anything. He said, I'm terrible at pottery. I said, what? He said, my therapist suggested a creative outlet and I'm taking pottery and I'm genuinely awful at it. He said, I keep centering the clay and then losing it every time I try to go further. I said, I've heard that's common. He said, my teacher says I have good instincts for the centering and bad instincts for everything that comes after. I said, that might be a metaphor. He said, I think she just means I'm bad at pottery. I said, probably. He said, but I like going. I said, that seems like the part that matters. He said, yeah, I think so too. He went back inside. I stayed on the porch for a few more minutes by myself. The cold was the right kind of cold for the kind of thinking I was doing, which was not structured thinking exactly, more like standing in a wide open space and letting what was in the air arrive at the right speed. I thought about the log from 2 years ago. I thought about the case note I had filed in January when the calls stopped and the way I had closed the file with the clinical precision I had trained myself to maintain and the way the precision had worked and not worked at the same time. I thought about every family dinner in the past 6 years and every sideways question and every sound my mother made in the middle of a conversation that was the sound of something she couldn't get to. I thought about the ring on the kitchen table and the small click it made when it landed. The back door opened and I heard my mother come out and stand beside me. She was wearing the gray cardigan she had been wearing all day, and she crossed her arms against the cold and stood beside me looking at the backyard, which was brown and late autumn and exactly what it should be. Neither of us said anything for a while. That was also exactly what it should be. Then she said, I didn't understand. I said, I know. She said, I knew you were good at it. I always knew that, but I didn't understand what it was. I said, you couldn't see it from the outside. Nobody can. She said, I kept thinking, what is she building? What will she have to show? What will I say in 10 years when someone asks what Sophie does and I want to say something that means something? I said, you'll say I listen to people when no one else is in the room. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I should have trusted that you knew what it was." I said, "You were afraid for me. I know what that looks like." She said, "I kept trying to understand the worth of it and I was looking at the wrong thing." I said, "The worth of it is Marcus Webb's daughter falling asleep on your couch." She said, "Yes." She said it simply, the way you say yes when you've been using the wrong word for something for a very long time and you finally have the right one. She said, "Yes, I know that now." We stood in the cold a little longer. The lights from inside the house made a warm rectangle on the porch, and somewhere inside I could hear the sound of conversation and a child's voice, and the particular sound of a kitchen being occupied by people who are comfortable together. She said, "That car of yours is an embarrassment." I said, "The car is fine." She said, "The seat is broken." I said, "I know how my own seat works." She said, "I'm just telling you what I see." I said, "I know what you're telling me." She laughed a little quietly, the way she laughs when she is being caught at something. I laughed too. We went back inside. Marcus and Dana and Lily left at 7 o'clock. Lily had woken from her nap with the serene indifference of a 4-year-old who treats sleep as something that happens to her and has no bearing on what she intends to do next, and she ate another small portion of pie at the table and discussed the Basset Hounds with my Aunt Carol with great seriousness before being zipped back into her bare button coat. Marcus shook hands with my mother at the door and she said, "Take good care of yourself and your family." And he said, "That's the plan," and meant it. He stopped in front of me in the doorway and shook my hand and didn't let go for a moment and then did. And he said, "Thank you." Not for the call, just thank you. I said, "Thank you for finding me." He said, "Thank Priya." I said, "I absolutely will." I watched them go down the porch steps and across the driveway, and I watched the car back out. And I stood in the doorway for a moment after the taillights disappeared. And then I came back inside, and my mother handed me a dish towel without being asked. We washed the dishes together, the three of us, the way we had always washed the dishes on Thanksgiving, my mother washing and me and Elena drying and putting away. It was not a conversation exactly. It was something more like the resumption of something that had been interrupted for a long time and was now carefully picking back up. My mother said things in her ordinary voice and I answered in mine, and Elena told a story about a client meeting that made all three of us laugh. And the kitchen had the smell of the holiday settling into the walls, the way holidays do. And it was ordinary. And underneath the ordinary, it was entirely different from every Thanksgiving that had come before it. Later, when Elena had gone up to bed and the kitchen was quiet, my mother sat down at the table and looked at the spot where the ring had been. She said, "How many years does it take?" I said, "I don't know." I said, "Every call is different." She said, "But you've been doing it for 7 years." I said, "Yes." She said, "And you've never been able to tell me any of it?" I said, "No." She said, "That must have been lonely." I said, "It was sometimes." She said, "I'm sorry about the wedding." I did not ask her to explain which part. I said, "I know." She said, "I was afraid." I said, "I know that too." She looked at the table for another moment, and then she got up and turned off the overhead light, and the kitchen went to the quieter light of the small lamp in the corner, which is the light she leaves on all night, every night, the way she has always left a light on. A habit I have had in my own apartment for as long as I have had an apartment. She said, "Good night, Sophie." I said, "Good night, Mom." She went upstairs. I sat at the kitchen table for a little while by myself. The Basset Hounds were asleep in their beds, and the house had the breathing quality of a house after a full day, settling into itself. I texted Priya. I said, "He found me?" She said, "I know." I said, "How long did he work on you?" She said, "About 4 months." She said, "I made him earn it." I said, "Thank you." She said, "Go get some sleep." She sent one cranberry emoji. I sent one back. I turned off the small lamp and went upstairs. I drove home the next morning in the Subaru. The seat was at its 20-degree angle, and the bumper crack was where it had always been, and the radio played something I didn't recognize. And the drive home took 42 minutes in the clear morning light, and I spent most of it not thinking, which is unusual for me, and which felt like the right thing. In March, I bought a new car. It was also a Subaru. The dealer let me take it on a test drive alone, and I drove it for 11 minutes on the highway, and the seat lever worked perfectly, and I sat fully upright for the first time in 4 years and thought, well, all right, fine. I bought it. I drove out of the lot, feeling faintly guilty, and was over it by the first traffic light. My mother came to the counseling center in April. She had called Robert Calloway ahead of time, which I did not know, and Robert had said yes, and nobody had told me, which is now the second time the people in my life have arranged something large with the patients I had not given them credit for. I came out of a meeting on a Wednesday afternoon and she was sitting in the waiting area talking to Priya with what appeared to be total ease, and Priya was showing her something on her phone and they were both laughing. And I stood in the hallway for a moment and looked at the two of them and thought about what it means when the people you love most finally find each other. She stayed for an hour. I showed her the office, the call logs in aggregate form, the charts that showed the pattern of our program's reach over 4 years. She looked at all of it with the careful attention she gives to things she has decided to take seriously. She asked me how long the training was before a counselor takes calls alone. She asked what Robert does when the hard calls land too close together. She asked, quietly, looking at the call log on the wall, how many of these had a Marcus Webb in them? I said, I didn't know how to answer that. She said, I know you can't answer that. She said, I just want to understand how many times something like that happened and you couldn't tell anyone. I said, the work is made of those times. That's most of what it is. She said, okay. She nodded, slowly. She said, okay. Before she left, she stood in the doorway of my office and she said, I'm going to tell Sherry what you do. I said, what do you mean? She said, Brianna's mother. She asked me at the wedding and I told her the pamphlet version. I said, okay. She said, I know the real version now. I said, you can tell her the real version. She said, I know. She put her hand on the doorframe for a moment and looked at me in the way she sometimes looks at me when she is putting something together. She said, I've been proud of you for a long time. I just didn't know how to say it about this. I said, Mom. She said, I know. She said, I'm saying it now. She hugged me in the lobby. My mother is not a person who hugs easily or frequently. She hugs at airports and at certain Christmases, and occasionally when she has been surprised into it by something larger than her usual composure. She hugged me in the lobby of the Veterans and Military Families Counseling Center on a Wednesday afternoon in April, and I hugged her back, and neither of us said anything because nothing needed to be said, and the moment lasted as long as it needed to last, which was approximately right. I went back to my desk. The afternoon call sheet had 3 names on it. I took the ibuprofen that I had been delaying since noon. I put the window shade to half. I looked at the first name. The phone rang. I picked up on the second ring. Some work leaves no record except in the people who carry it forward. And sometimes, when the timing is right and the right people find each other across the distance of a sealed line and 2 years of silence, those people walk through a door in November and set down a ring on a kitchen table and give you back the proof you never knew you were waiting for. The worth of invisible work is not found in what you can show. It is found in who comes back through the door.